should be.
Look, I should just digress for a moment and declare my own conflict of interest here, because I can say for the last 50 years, if it hadn't been for ABC TV and ABC Radio, I don't know what I would have done. So I need to just state that up front. But, you mentioned Fran as an example of the outstanding journalists and producers that have graced ABC airwaves and television. You would have worked with many, many of them, and I know it's invidious to single any out, but can you give us who stands out for you, Geraldine? What kind of impact did they have on you and on the reporting of current affairs?
Oh, well, look, Caroline Jones definitely does stand out. I mean, she became a very good friend. And of course, she died early this year, which was very sad, although I don't really think that Caroline would have wanted to linger on. So there we are. Caroline did really, I think, in ways that you only really grasp when you're growing older yourself, that she just set a standard. She both went television, radio. I still remember her City Extra on 2BL, and the crosses with Clive Robertson and everything, the wit and all of that. We can all remember it. And Caro was never stopped trying, never stopped adapting, never stopped creating. They really mentoring young Indigenous female journalists, setting up that, working with the women in the media at the Caroline Jones Ward for Young Regional Journalists and so on and so forth. So she made a big difference. Look, Kerry O'Brien, now I'm going television first, then I'll go radio, because I actually reckon radio should have more of a Guernsey. But Kerry was one of those people. I don't defend everything Kerry did, not for a moment. But Kerry was a big character, afraid of nothing. And there was some sort of real sense of great drama around Kerry, if you know what I mean, that I, again, never forgot. I do think that in radio, Radio National has just, I feel so honoured to have been part of Radio National, even though I started in news when I came to the ABC. I think in Radio National, I think it's a pearl in Australia. And its slogan, think bigger. Maybe it's saying it too much, but gee, who else says that? That's what Australians need to do. And I've worked with a lot of people who've behind the scenes, and marvellous sound engineers. I really don't want to single out more. I mean, I think Tony Jones was an excellent foreign correspondent. He was a sort of fantastic character. I think Australian Story has done some marvellous stuff there. So, look, there's a lot.
Yes, of course there is, of course. But just dwelling on Caroline Jones for a moment, and subsequently Margaret Throsby, it was hard to break through that glass ceiling. I remember it at the time. There were the most absurd theories going around that women's voices were not suited to radio. What an absurd thing to say now, in retrospect.
I know.
It was difficult, wasn't it?
Oh, yes. And they had to, it's only now that we're getting, I think, a lot of real deep, granular thinking about the nature of internalized prejudice, that you realize what they did break through with, how much you played much more. I mean, even I, who came in, you played much more of the boys' game, I think, because the boys could be very good indeed. The idea that they weren't, I always say this, they were exceptionally talented, game, innovative, but I think the really clever thing was to work out how you did your stories. And see, Caroline did. I think she really blazed that hybrid role. She had a very wide curiosity, and she employed that curiosity. And of course, she was incredibly witty. She's incredibly witty. Humour's a very valuable tool. And Fran yesterday was saying to me, in terms of they're sort of still devising, frankly, and she said, they write jokes, but I'm not funny. She said, I'm not funny, and I really respected her. She said it with a complete straight face. She's right. That's not her skill base.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, you are, but I'm not. And
but I'm not Fran. Geraldine, what about, do any particular stories stand out for you, particularly ones that ABC has aired that wouldn't have made it on commercial networks? Can you make that distinction?
Well, I don't think, for instance, going back, I was particularly, because, your producer said, look, think about this. I was thinking of a lot of the Chris Masters, Peter Manning stories. I could cite Peter Manning too, who was a marvellous head of news and current affairs. I mean, he was, really memorable. Now, several of those, the Moonlight State, talking about corruption in Queensland, which prompted the Fitzgerald Royal Commission, the Big League, about rugby league. Now, imagine that getting onto commercial.
No chance. No chance.
The one about the Greenpeace ship, for instance, like there were several of them.
Rainbow Warrior.
Rainbow Warrior, thank you. I think a lot of those would never have had a Guernsey. And you see, and can I cite Australian Story too? Because Australian Story is part of the news. You might think it's part of features, but it's not. It was a very clever outreach, again, of Peter Manning, who decided we had to do broader stories that amounted to, you might almost call them soft news, the distinction between hard and soft news. See, I think Australian Story was incredibly important in saying to Australians, we have marvellous stories here, great character stories. They trailblaze, they shift the agenda, they're people stories, and they are news. Now, that was a real breakthrough. And that, I reckon it's really set the agenda, backed up by the sort of glossy magazines, the Weekend Australian and the Good Weekend, which, I really love that. I think that's beautiful journalism, depth journalism about our people. Now, that used not to happen.
Geraldine, we've talked about the difficulty initially it was for women to get on air, and we've talked about the need for diversity. How does ageism fit into that?
Oh, what an interesting topic that is. Look, I got a bit of a shock recently at the response when Fran, having done the 17 years, getting up at 3:30 and most definitely done it well, and then finally just sort of thought, no, I can't do another day of it, really. When she was given that new role, and there was some very nasty stuff written about aging people being given things ahead of young ones. And actually, to her great credit, Patricia Karvelis, who succeeded Fran on Breakfast, wrote a very good piece saying, hello, how many older women do we see on television, please? So look, it showed me that it's still very much alive and well. And